Welcome back to another episode of the Shared Practices podcast. I have a very exciting episode today for you guys. In talking about startups, we've talked a lot about real estate, just like in acquisitions, we talked a lot about practice financials because I really believe the real estate is one of the most important things that you need to be looking at when looking into a startup. So I have on today Brian Madden, and Brian is in the Northeast. I believe he's based out of Philadelphia, and he works for Carr Healthcare Realty. If you remember back to an episode we had with Morgan Stump, he talks about the importance of working with somebody who's in healthcare realty. They're at no cost to you as a searcher for a practice location, but they're of huge value. So I'm really excited for today's episode. We'll go ahead and get started, and I hope you guys enjoy. I have with me here today Brian Madden, and Brian is in healthcare realty. And if you guys remember from an episode we had with Morgan Stump and a few episodes on the podcast, we talked about working with somebody that works for a healthcare realty company to help you find the location for your startup. And since this season is all about startups, I thought it'd be a good idea to have Brian on to talk about some of the considerations you need to make in the commercial real estate. I think one of the things that we talk about, like when we had acquisitions, we talked about the financials and reading the reports for the practice in ad nauseum, is because I think that's one of the most important things when looking at, an acquisition outside of vision and whatnot. But with startups, we talk a lot about real estate because I think, the success of the startup is heavily based on the location. I think that's incredibly important, and so I'm happy to have Brian on today to talk with you guys about the commercial real estate and all that goes into it. So, Brian, why don't you go ahead and, first of all, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks, George. Thanks very much. I appreciate you having me on, and congratulations on your practice.
Thank you. And so, why don't you go ahead and tell us about your background and what got you into healthcare realty and a little bit what you do.
So I work for a company called Carr Healthcare Realty, and we are a tenant-only, purchase-only, healthcare-specific commercial real estate firm. Most of our work is in the dental space. So we generally work with doctors with their real estate issues related to startup, transitions. We do a lot of lease renewals, some ground-up construction as well. But that's basically the lane that we stay in, and we kind of think of ourselves as the real estate police for doctors.
The real estate police. Can you elaborate on that for me?
I mean, what we've seen is, we've seen a lot of doctors, unfortunately, just call the number on the sign, right? And these leases, if you're doing a 10-year lease, they can be anywhere. I mean, it depends on square footage and where you're at and what you're paying, obviously. But, they could be $500,000 or $750,000 or $1 million or more over the course of those 10 years. And that's just for the rent. That's not before you're accounting for the build out costs and your equipment and your working capital, and then the money you're going to dedicate to SEO and marketing, et cetera. So this is a huge amount of money at play. And unfortunately, what we've seen is that a lot of doctors will simply call the number on the sign, and that's the landlord's broker, right? So you're talking about somebody who has a listing agreement with and a fiduciary duty to the landlord. So, some of these guys are very nice guys and they're just doing their jobs, but they'll tell the doctor, hey, we can represent you too, and here's the deal. And some doctors are swift enough to know that, hey, whatever they're offering at first there's got to be some room on it, and they'll negotiate. But they don't really know where the floor is because they don't have access to subscription services and market knowledge, et cetera. So basically everyone's leaving a lot of money on the table. And some doctors haven't even pushed back, and they just think it's like ordering pizza, and they'll say, hey, the price is $16.99 with pepperoni and okay, and then they'll move on to the next item. But you're talking about an expense that's usually the second highest expense in your practice after payroll, and we're routinely seeing guys that are 20-30% over market.
So I'm assuming that you guys handle a lot of the negotiation that goes into the lease.
Yeah, so what we'll do, in a startup context, what we'll do is we'll meet with the doctor, we'll determine the budget, the time horizons, the type of vision that they have for the practice, the square footage, et cetera, the number of operatories they want, and then we'll go fetch. So we'll go out and vet those properties that are in the market that the doctor wants to be in. A lot of times we're running on, demographics from some of these providers that do those searches. And then we'll find the best, say, 6 or 8 properties and present those to the doctor, and then we'll tour out on, maybe the top 4 or 5. And negotiate the best properties against each other. So we'll ensure that the zoning is proper, that the parking requirements fit the zoning, and then we'll create an environment where all of those landlords know that there's competition for the space, and we'll advocate on behalf of the doctor and articulate as to why the dentist use is so desirable for a landlord, that the default rate is, less than 1% nationally, or at least under 1% nationally. And they're talking about a long-term tenant. They're going to put in the improvements. They're unlikely to move as long as the landlord's reasonable. And then once they sell, they're going to be selling to a younger dentist who then may be in there for 20 plus years. So I've seen some buildings that have had a continuous dental use for 40 years. So you're talking about a government bond essentially for these landlords, and especially in the age of Amazon and retail's going out, that's a very desirable use for the landlord. So, we've had some of these doctors say, well, the pizza place or the nail salon's paying X, so I guess I'll just pay X. And it's the same situation where if you had a checkered driving history, you should be paying more for your auto insurance, and if you're accident free, then you should be paying less. So the terms on that deal should reflect and be congruent with the credit profile of the incoming tenant dentist.
So a few things come to mind. First, do you guys have access to deals that you wouldn't have access to if you just search kind of LoopNet or whatever commercial real estate listing website there is?
Right. So LoopNet's the open source marketplace that's online. So there's a subscription service called CoStar that's pretty expensive. So it's not something that you would subscribe to for a one-off transaction. So that is a pretty amazing platform, and most commercial real estate professionals will have access to the same platform. So CoStar will have all the available listings that are out there. And then if you've been in the market for a while, you have a relationship with landlord brokers, and sometimes properties that aren't actively being marketed that may become available, they'll say, hey, this doctor is thinking about retiring at such and such time. If you have something that makes sense, let us know. Or you'll know about space that's already built out, et cetera. So essentially there's a lot more out there than what's just going to be on LoopNet.
And then I know I don't mean to ask you about your compensation structure on air, but I think somebody in the audience may be wondering, because I know that technically you're a real estate agent, correct, or a real estate broker. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah, we'd be right. We're all agents, and then the brokerage would be held by the parenting company.
So then, is your compensation for your added healthcare knowledge, is there an extra compensation that you would receive, or how does the compensation structure work?
So our services are always free to the doctor. So the way it works in commercial real estate and residential real estate is that the landlord or the seller is always going to pay the compensation. Is always going to pay the commissions. So say it's if it's a traditional retail setting and there's a general doc who wants to be next to the Whole Foods or a Wegmans or something, that the owner of that property will have a listing agreement with their own broker. Sometimes 5%, sometimes 6% of the total base value of that lease. And then if that broker can get a dentist in there without representation, they'll keep that entire amount for themselves, which is essentially a double commission. What usually happens is that if there's representation, that commission will then be split. But in either scenario, that money, that commission, has already been accounted for and baked into the rent. So you can't get a better deal by trying to do it to yourself or do it by yourself, because there's already, that's already been accounted for and baked in. So that's generally how the comp structure works.
And, a couple things, I think, first one, just by calling the number on the sign without representation, you are giving that broker, the selling broker, double commission on that, because then now they're representing you. But the other thing is, I was talking to my co-host for the season, Jonas Ashbaugh, and he was talking about how he really felt like he needed somebody to negotiate on his behalf, just because as a dentist, they're not really going to negotiate with you, even if you do know what you're talking about, because you're not really, I think they would negotiate with someone like you because you have more knowledge, and, you're maybe viewed as you are a more credible, person in that space. So have you found that to be the case as well?
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely seen, I've come in after some negotiations have started on certain deals. And there's a significant difference between what they're willing to do for a represented tenant versus an unrepresented tenant. So that landlord's broker has every reason to keep a tenant's broker out, because they're going to double their own commission, and then they're going to have what's generally an uninformed or somewhat informed, underinformed prospective tenant who doesn't have access to comps, hasn't done prior deals in the market, doesn't know what the rate should be or what concessions should be available to dentists that aren't available to a nail salon or a pizza store or something along those lines. So we've seen that for sure, that the deals that were done solo by docs, especially when we get involved in lease renewals, which is another topic that we can talk about. But when we do get involved in lease renewals, we're reviewing leases that were signed, 8 years ago, 9 years ago, and they were done by the dentist, and sometimes with quote unquote representation of that broker who has told him that, hey, I can represent the landlord and you, which of course is, is preposterous. I mean, I came from the litigation world, so that was anathema. It wasn't a situation you would walk in and take advice from the opposing party's attorney, right? So, but for whatever reason, that's developed in commercial real estate where that's common with sole proprietors. But most of the larger corporations are going to have their own real estate teams and know that they need representation.
So then, you're in a deal. Well, first, I think on the renewal subject, I think that's very applicable to a lot of our listeners. Because I think, this is a game of leverage where the earlier you negotiate, the more leverage you have, kind of, because you have more time to move if you have to. So how early
Correct.
do you plan, or how early do you like to negotiate those renewals?
So realistically, I mean, you can consult with a broker from Carr or another broker about your situation and try and get a handle on the comps and where you're at. There's no harm in doing that sooner than later. But realistically speaking, you have to create a situation where the landlord believes that there's a credible possibility that you're going to leave. If they don't think that you're going to go anywhere, then they're not going to give you any concessions, or they're going to give you very small concessions. So, in other words, you can't start that out 2 years away because they know that you still have 2 years left of term, so you're not entertaining serious proposals from other spaces. So generally, we like to get involved about 12 months out on a lease renewal, and that way, 12 months out from the date that you have to give notice. So you have to look at your lease, because sometimes it'll be 3 months, sometimes it'll be 6 months, sometimes it'll be a full year that you have to give notice before the termination of your lease to the landlord to let them know what you're going to do. So we want to get out in front of that and create a situation where we've looked at the market, we've possibly negotiated other properties. I mean, generally we are negotiating other properties. And then when we come back to that landlord, we can say, hey, here's the 3 or 4 other options we have. You either treat this dentist properly and give him a financial package that comports with the ambient conditions in the market, or we're leaving. And then they generally will be reasonable and come down to some degree, depending on what the underlying terms were to begin with.
So one thing I saw on Facebook the other day is somebody was talking about a 5-year lease. They were looking at a startup, and they were looking at a 5-year lease, and they were wondering, they said 5 years seems long, and they were wondering if they could get any shorter. And from my perspective, I felt like, it was one of those things where I didn't feel like commenting, so I kind of scrolled past it, but,
Right.
I feel like your kind of minimum is 10 with a startup. I mean, is that what you guys are seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple things about that. I guess if number one, if you're trying to do a 3 or even 5-year lease, the landlord is not going to give you significant concessions in terms of a tenant improvement allowance or free rent, et cetera. So you really need to sign a 10-year lease to get the concessions that you want, and sometimes need, depending on your financial picture or what your loan package looks like, to get started. If you're looking at $30, $40, $50, $60 in TI to help you defray the cost of that build, because you still have to save money for equipment and everything else. And number two is realistically, you're not going anywhere in 5 years or 3 years. If you build out and you're doing well, you're going to be there for 10 years, and you're very likely to be there more if you're cranking and the landlord's treating you well. So I think you're shooting yourself in the foot. If you're trying to sign a 3 or 5 year up front, you're going to end up footing most of your own build out yourself, and then you're going to end up renewing anyway, and you'll be held hostage by the landlord. It's much preferable to get a 10-year base term with 2 5-year options, and in that way, the landlord will give you concessions that comport with that term so that he can recapture his investment into the space and amortize that out over the 10 years. And then the practical reality is that the banks are going to make sure that there's enough term on that lease that is congruent with the terms on their loan. So if they're giving you a loan for 10 years, they're not going to allow you to sign a 3-year lease.
Yeah, or they'll at least require that you have a couple 5-year options, correct?
Or that, yeah, at least that you can control the space for the period of time of the loan. Correct. Yeah.
So,
Yep.
Talking about those 10 years now, you've gained leverage. So, you talked about TI money. So, what other things are you looking for, like in your negotiations? What are your big things that you really want to get? And then talk about, I think, the importance of TI money. I mean, I really like high TI money, but, maybe talk about the importance of it versus some other things you could be getting.
First of all, it depends on the space and what the condition is. If it's a gray shell space, you're going to need more because you're going to have to finish it. If it's a vanilla box space, then you may not need as much because a lot of what you need is already in there in terms of HVAC and electrics run and the demising walls are up. But, you're probably going to blow it out and do the design that you want to do in there. So sometimes it's almost preferable to have a gray shell space and then additional TI dollars so that you can fit it out and stretch those dollars the way that you want. But that's, TI is a big deal, especially if you have a package loan that's sort of a standard number at 5 or 550, and you're trying to take a larger size space at 2,500 or 3,000, then the cost to fit that out, depending on where you are, in Philadelphia area, if you're out in the counties, in more rural areas, it could be $100 a square foot. If you're in the inner suburbs, you're probably looking at 120 or more north of that. And then in the city itself, you're dealing with union labor and everything's more expensive. And it could be well north of 130 a square foot. And then, of course, that depends on the contractor and the finishes, et cetera. And certain areas like Seattle and Washington, D.C. are well north of that. So you have to account for all that. And if the build-out cost is going to be $300,000 or more, then that's eating up a huge piece of your startup loan if it's capped at 500. So TI is important to get worked into the deal, and landlords, frankly, expect to pay something. They know that they need to pay to attract tenants into the space, and they understand the startup context for the most part. And if they don't, then it's our job to educate them on that. The other things that we want to see are you have to check the zoning, obviously. You have to check parking requirements. Different townships have different parking requirements for medical uses, so that's something you need to get out in front of. And then in terms of the actual lease provisions, we always want to see exclusivity in there to ensure that you're the only dentist in the space or you're the only pedo dentist in that space. Most landlords aren't going to want to create a situation where there's competition and make it harder for you to pay rent, but that's something that you want to see. A relocation clause can be a major problem, especially if you're talking about the capital-intensive costs of dental to build out. If a landlord has another national credit type tenant that comes in and wants to take up space that's including the space that you're currently in, and you don't have a strong relocation clause, then they can move you. You're still under contract, and you would have to pay the cost of your move and rebuild. Unless you've either got that clause out of there or you've made it such that he will foot the cost of your business interruption and include the cost of your build in the new space. So that's some of the issues that you want to see. I mean, there's a whole host of issues you deal with once you get to the lease phase itself. But up front, those are some of the things we cover. HVAC, you want to rate it to 300, about 300 square feet to 1 ton. For the electric, you want to make sure you have 3-phase, 200 amp. These kind of things that we put in the meat, the major items that we'll put in the LOI before it gets to the lease phase.
And for everybody listening, TI stands for tenant improvements. And I want to talk a little bit. So let's just say your build out is very expensive. My understanding is, don't they pay that tenant improvements money? Do they pay it upon signing the lease, or do they pay it kind of down the road?
It depends on how you structure it. Most landlords want to have it payable upon you receiving a CO, your certificate of occupancy, at the end. We like to see it either paid up front or paid progressively, that the dentist can send those invoices to the landlord for payment directly to the contractors as they come in. And that just from a cash flow standpoint, that's how we like to do it. So yeah, there's always going to be some tension there on how that's paid.
Yeah, I think that's pretty a big deal because, you don't want to, deplete all your capital, get through construction, and then be waiting on that money to come in when you're probably needed to buy equipment and whatnot. So
100%.
I think when you can structure that, it's probably a bigger deal than maybe people realize. The
Yeah,
other thing, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I meant to say, I mean, obviously assignability is huge too. So that's something that we will put in the LOI. And we found that if you put in the terms that you want with the language you want in the LOI, you're much more likely to get it in the lease phase. If you have a very robust LOI that covers most of these items, that's when the tenant has the most leverage and the most power. Once there's an LOI signed and it goes to the lease phase, the landlords know that you're spending money on your architecture and you're starting to look at everything that you're going to need. You got money on the street, you fall in love with the space, you're starting to plan it. Then it's tougher to get really tenant-friendly language in the lease, and it drives up your legal costs as they're trying to fight it. So, we always try and put very robust assignability language in the LOI to ensure that you can assign your lease. You try and get it at your own discretion. Sometimes you're going to, have that traditional language where it says not to be unreasonably held, withheld, et cetera. But I think that's an important point is to try and get all those terms in up front so that by the time the lease is actually being negotiated, they're not really an issue anymore.
More of that after the break, but first, a word from our sponsor. Okay, now that you've realized that your neck hurts, the next part that should frustrate you about your current pair of loops is that there's this wasted space between the bottom of the frame and where it's comfortable to look down. So I want you to look down when you're wearing your loops. So look below the loops, below the frame. And if you look down really far, like as far as you can without moving your head, eventually that's strained, that's uncomfortable. You can't have the loops that far down. You can't hold that for a while. There's this whole zone of comfortable space between the bottom of the frames and where the loops could be placed that's wasted because of your current frame. Q Optics has designed not only a new frame, but also a way of measuring the space of your face. They actually take like a face bow of you and take a picture of it and put it in the computer. There's this little contraption with green dots that you wear on a pair of glasses, and they take a photo from the front and a photo from the side. And they've got some fancy names for it, but essentially they're doing a map of your face, a 3D map of your face, and maximizing the amount of frame that can dip down and they can put loops in. Why wouldn't you maximize that for every single person? Well, it's easy. It's easier to just buy a bunch of preset frames than it is to make custom frames for everybody. So if you're interested in maximizing the real estate that you have available, you can send an email to sales@qoptics.com with the promo code SP16 for $100 off a pair of loops or $300 off of a loop and light combo. It's time for you to stop wasting all that space.
And I think that's just kind of a general contract rule. Anytime you have a two phases like that, where you have an LOI, a more simple non-binding agreement that goes over some basic terms, and then you have the more robust document, whether it's a purchase agreement or a lease, I think it's always good to get as much language in the LOI as possible to minimize legal costs and, hassles down the road. Is that kind of what you agree with as well?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, so the LOI is a non-binding document, like you just said. But, when you get to the lease phase, all of a sudden people are waving around the LOI and saying, well, it wasn't the LOI, and that's not what we agreed upon, and that wasn't contemplated in the deal, et cetera. So, I couldn't agree more. If you can get the meat and potatoes of what you really want and what's going to be thought about later up in the LOI, then it makes everything a lot smoother later and will save cost.
So now, a simple question, but so you're an attorney.
Correct.
Do you actually do the lease as well for your clients or no?
So I'm just the broker. So I just do the brokerage. We'll identify the property and negotiate out the terms of the LOI, and then we'll hand it off to a dental specific attorney, guys like Rob Montgomery, who will hammer out the actual specific details of the lease itself.
Yeah, I love Rob. I used Justin Weaver, who's part of Rob's firm. And
great guys.
Yeah, awesome. And so, now that you have identified a property, now what my question was, you have this kind of balance between TI money and free rent. I'm assuming that they're very similar in that, it's kind of an upfront subsidy. Do you prefer to negotiate harder on the TI money, or do you prefer to negotiate on the rent?
Yeah, it depends on the situation. It depends on the doctor's financial situation and what they want to see and what they need to make their build happen. Sometimes you'll see a place that's been vacant for 2 or 3 years. I'm working on a deal like that right now, and the landlord was willing to give additional free rent because it's sitting there idle anyway. If it's a brand new space that just got built and everyone's clamoring for it, it's very difficult to get the free rent on the backside. So what we like to do is try and get 5 months to build. So there'll be, you sign the lease, and then you have 5 months. So that'll be the execution date is when you sign. Then you'll have 5 months to build, and then that's when the lease will commence. And then we try and get additional free rent for, say, 2, 3, 4 months on the backside of that build, so that your first couple months in the space, there's no payments due, especially if you're going to be a PPO practice and you're waiting 2 months or longer for your payments to come back to you after service. We can explain all this to the landlord, and a lot of times they're receptive to it and understand.
So now, so then you have the build-out period, do whatever, 5 months to build, and then you get 2 or 4 months of free rent, and then after that, is it full rent for the remainder of the lease?
Yeah, then you would go to full rent, and then you'll have escalators in that lease. We like to see 2%, 2.5%, 3% is very reasonable, and that's kind of what gets settled upon. I mean, I've seen some leases with 4% or even 5% escalators, and that's a compounding number, obviously. So that's another reason when we talk about lease renewals, that some of these guys are way over market by the time they're getting to year 7, 8, 9, 10 on a lease, because it's been compounding at 5% every year, which is well north of what it should be.
So now, I'm assuming, so we've talked a lot about lease negotiation and everything after you've identified a site. Now, I'm assuming one of the biggest things you probably help people with, and much more important than, in my opinion, than negotiating on a specific site, is selecting the correct site. So, first, I'm assuming you agree with that statement.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, it's huge. I mean, especially, there's been a trend I've seen that the generals, the orthos, the pedos want to be more in a retail setting, or at least in a high visibility, high traffic count, excellent signage type of setting. It's good for everyone to be in a good spot. But I mean, if you're an endo or a pros and you're getting referrals, then it's less of an issue. But location is huge.
So now, what are the, so kind of describe your role there, and what are some of the biggest things that you guys are looking at in helping people decide on the correct location?
So we have on CoStar, we'll have access to the traffic counts, median household income, children per household, all that sort of stuff. A lot of times our startup clients are using a consultant like Jamie Amos, or they're at the very least getting, a report from Demografics or Scott McDonald or one of those guys to ID areas that they want to be in up front. And then once we kind of get an idea of where we want to be, we can check individual buildings and determine, another issue is you got to determine what the state of the building is too. So if it's an older building and there's issues with the HVAC, depending on how the lease is written, that could be on you when that goes, et cetera. So those are some other issues. But yeah, we'll help the doctor and explain where we've seen other people succeed and what we think might be a good spot for the doctor to set up and for what reasons.
So in the process of doing a startup, in my view, finding the correct location seems to be, from talking to people, the most time-consuming part of the whole thing. Is that what you've been seeing as well? Yeah,
it takes a long time. Or sometimes you negotiate a deal, or you find the perfect building, the landlord won't budge on the financials, and they won't, make concessions to a dentist, even though it's a pretty obvious that that's a good use. So it takes a while. I mean, it can take months and months. It can take 6 months by the time you really run through everything, negotiate the properties out, and find the right spot. It can be a time-consuming process for sure.
Yeah, that's, so from my perspective as somebody who's, I guess more involved in acquisitions, I feel like when you find the right practice, you kind of just do whatever it takes to land that one, knowing that the way that the market values are for purchase prices, it'll make sense if it cash flows well.
Right.
But, with real estate, I think it's a bit different. So can you talk about some things that maybe break up what may be like a great spot, great demographics, great visibility, something you really like, but for whatever reason, the terms of the lease make the deal fall apart. So what kind of things can make that happen?
I mean, most of the time in a retail setting, it's been okay. I mean, we haven't had too many that fell apart. We've had a couple that have fallen apart. Usually it's just because the landlord doesn't want to make concessions that we want to see on a spot. So they want to have an assignability clause that's incredibly landlord friendly. They want to maintain the relocation clause in case they get a national credit tenant that wants to take your space. They won't, or they won't give you the concessions that we feel like we deserve or need in certain contexts to get the startup done. So a lot of times it really breaks down on the financials and some of the lease terms. If it's a spot that doesn't make sense, we'll vet that out ahead of time. So we're only going to see. The way we work is that once we meet with the doctor, we'll have an agency agreement signed, and we'll just work exclusively for them. So we will go out and actively go through the market and pre-vet all of the properties that are out there that fit the requirement of the doctor. So by the time we're actually touring and negotiating, usually the properties themselves are something that we want. It's just a matter of which landlords are willing to make certain concessions that we want to see or need to see in a deal.
I mean, help me understand this relocation clause for a second, because I'd be really, really pissed off, to be honest, if I have a corner unit on a visible area and some national tenant like Pizza Hut wants to come and take my spot. The fact that they can move me to maybe a less visible area, I mean, how is that like actually practically okay? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, we just won't get in every lease that I've done out here, we just refuse. If they won't budge on that, then we just won't do the deal, and we'll know that up front. So you hear these horror stories, and some of them are true, but it hasn't happened to me because we just don't. Montgomery's based in Philadelphia, so he does a lot of the deals that we're on. And if there's a relocation clause in there, we usually just won't proceed at that location because we've had 3 or 4 other locations that we're negotiating simultaneously. If the doctor really, really, really loves the spot and the landlord won't budge, then we'll make the relocation clause, the sanctions in that clause, draconian enough that they wouldn't want to do it. So, they'd have to be getting so much more in rent from Pizza Hut that it would make sense for them to move you to a suboptimal location and then pay for the cost of your build out, pay for the cost of the rental interruption in terms of what that's done to your business income, et cetera. So if they want to maintain that as an option in case somebody shows up and says, hey, I'm going to pay you $100 a square foot or something insane, sometimes the landlords want to keep that, but we'll make the wording of the lease itself that relates to the relocation clause so burdensome that they really wouldn't trigger that.
Yeah, it just seems to me like that'd be such a terrible situation.
I've seen leases on Lease Renewals that I wasn't involved in originally that have a landlord-friendly relocation clause. I mean, a lot of times it isn't triggered because dentists are good tenants and they stay there and they pay. But technically they could move you, and if you haven't negotiated properly, the costs of that move and rebuild are on the dentist, which could be crushing.
So now, going back to your role with relation to startups and helping people find, with the whole real estate component, what kind of general advice do you have for doctors out there that you see in all of your experience working with doctors doing startups that you feel like maybe they could improve on to make the process go better for them?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing if it's Carr Healthcare Realty or if it's somebody else, get yourself a broker. Like I said, the landlord brokers are not bad people, but this is American capitalism, and they're not gonna. This isn't a fraternal order or something, so no one's gonna negotiate against themselves or give you a deal. They're only gonna give you the best terms possible if they feel like they need to earn your business. So the first thing you should do is contact a broker that has dental specific knowledge and experience and has done at least 10 or 15 dental deals in your area. That will cut through a lot of the mistakes and where the minds are in the field. Frankly, that's probably the number one mistake I see is that dentists have called the landlord's broker on the sign and started down that path with that one particular property and that one particular broker. And they end up with very mediocre terms or sometimes very poor terms. The other thing to be careful of is if you do get a broker and they do both sides of the street. So I would try and find a tenant-only or purchase-only broker. A lot of these brokers will do landlord work one day and they'll do tenant work the next day. So a lot of times you find yourself touring buildings that are listed with that same company, which obviously creates a conflict. Or you have a situation where, hey, maybe there's a 20,000 square foot medical building and you're going to take 2,000 square feet and your broker is hoping to earn the business of that landlord downstream. So he doesn't want to be aggressive, or he doesn't want to push too hard, because he's hoping that maybe he can earn the listings on those remaining 9 spaces in that building. So we're always professional, and we're always polite and et cetera, but we don't really care what the landlords think, because we're never going to work for a landlord. We're never going to take their listings. So we advocate exclusively for the dental tenant. So these are things you have to, be careful of who you're working with and what their motivations are.
I like that a lot. And I think one thing that I think, I don't know if you mentioned it on air or off air, but Rich Andrews was a guest that we had, and he talked
Correct.
about
Yep.
an issue that he has is that landlords don't always realize the value of a dental tenant until you explain it to them. So technically, it's not leverage until both sides agree that that's an advantage. So is that something you're finding as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of the savvy landlords get it, but some don't, especially the smaller mom and pops don't get it. So they'll say, well, why should I give you this space at $22 square foot when I can lease it to Pizza Hut or whoever at 25 or 28? Well, Pizza Hut's a bad example because they're a good tenant with national credit. But if it's a regular pizza place or a nail salon or some other place that is very likely to go out of business at some point, I mean, 80% of restaurants fail within the first 5 years. So you look at that versus a dentist who's not going to default, and he's going to be there for 20 years, and he's going to sell his practice, and then somebody else is going to be there for another 20 years. And especially in the age of Amazon and retail, you can buy a lot of things online these days, and you don't need to go to the store, but you do need to go to the dentist. And Jeff Bezos doesn't have a drone to do molar endo or whatever. So that's a big selling point, is to say not only is the credit profile of a dentist excellent, and therefore the terms of the lease should comport with that credit profile. And number two, a lot of these retail places are going lights out, and the dentist is going to be there for decades. So we want terms that reflect that reality.
I think you bring up an interesting point with the whole Amazon thing. As I'm sitting here in my PJs interviewing you, obviously I like to do things from home. Yeah, I'm a big Amazon guy. I got Prime, and
yeah, right, we do too.
For me, I go to the mall and it's dead now, and it's.
Yeah.
I mean, talk about the effect of online sales and Amazon specifically to your job negotiating with landlords. Has it softened them up a lot?
It has. I mean, it's definitely made a material difference in negotiations. Once you start talking to a landlord about that, if they own a retail strip, they get nervous. I mean, if it's a medical office building, obviously it doesn't apply, and some of the office space it doesn't apply. But if it's that retail strip or a mixed use kind of area where they do have legitimate concerns about the future of retail, knowing that they can land a dentist who's going to be in there doing dentistry for decades is a huge selling point. I mean, that really stabilizes their portfolio, and there's an anchor in that center for them.
When most people think about a startup, they think that they are expensive and time-consuming. I'm here today to tell you that they are right, but it doesn't have to be. Starting a dental practice presents a list of challenges, but when it comes to making decisions about where to purchase your dental equipment, I recommend Dental Planet. Dental Planet provides affordable, comprehensive services that simplify the startup, expansion, or renovation process while dramatically improving your ROI of the entire project. If you need equipment, Dental Planet has new, factory recertified, and Dental Planet certified pre-owned digital imaging systems. As you know, a lot of your success as a startup is based on your ability to provide a great experience for your patients. The same can be said about Dental Planet. They provide telephone, email, and remote support, as well as multiple financing solutions. Dental Planet is even more affordable than many of their competitors. All products include a warranty backed by a nationwide network of service providers, along with expert sales consultants and technicians. Thousands of more items, including dental supplies, are also available when you use Dental Planet. Buying equipment for your startup doesn't have to be expensive with Dental Planet. You can save between 40 to 60%. See how easy and affordable upgrading, replacing, or expanding can be when you team up with Dental Planet. Just mention Shared Practices to get a discount on your already low prices. Learn more at dentalplanet.com. Again, that's DENTALPLANET.com. Again, mention Shared Practices to get a discount on your entire order. So now, but seriously, like the future of commercial real estate, how do you see it, now with the emergence of online industries? Just kind of on a general view.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, well, I mean, in the office space, they have WeWork and these type of places now. But that's sort of a different animal. But yeah, I mean, I think the internet has revolutionized everything. And specifically with what we do with the retailing. I mean, it's conspicuous. I mean, there's certain, I'm from Philadelphia, so there's certain centers that when I was a kid, I remember being always packed, and some of them are gone now, and some of them there's significant vacancies in them, and the prices have responded accordingly. I mean, there's places that are fairly reasonable now that weren't previously. So it's definitely had downward pressure on retail as a whole.
Man, it's just not a connection that I would have made right away, but when you said it earlier in the interview, it really made sense to me, and it's kind of unfortunate, but I guess it is advantageous.
Yeah, it's kind of like you were saying before we got on, man. I'm a child of the '80s, so I sort of yearn for those times or something where it wasn't pre-internet days, but. I mean, that's the reality of where things are. So when you talk to these landlords, that's another selling point for the dentist is that, wet finger dentistry is something that is going to be a requirement, for the American landscape for the foreseeable future. And people need to drive to the location and be there in person. And you can't do this online.
Love it. And so, Brian, wrapping up our interview here, do you have any other, anything you want to leave our dentists with? Who are in the process of a startup to really help them out?
Yeah, I think, with the startup stuff, just do your homework, make sure that you know exactly what you're doing with where you're going and why. Have a plan, be purposeful, make sure you have the demographics squared away. And if you're in love with an area, make sure you're in love with it for the right reasons. I've seen people go to desirable chic type of locations and in their head they want to stop at Starbucks and then pat a lab on the head on the way to work or something. You're the 15th guy that's figured that out, right? So the saturation levels in spaces like that are difficult. So you might be better off driving 30, 40, 50 minutes to your office and then living in nice areas, but your production might be double in an underserved area that has the saturation levels to support your profitability. And then the one last thing I would say is about lease renewals. I would really encourage everyone to take a look at their leases. If you are on a lease and you are in year 7, 8, 9, take a look at your lease because it's very likely that you're over market, especially if you didn't have representation at the outset of your lease, or if you purchased a practice that had a lease that wasn't negotiated properly. I just had a situation. Now, this is sort of a home run situation, but this happened last month where there was a doctor who's a very savvy businessman who owns multiple practices. And he bought a practice, and he knew that the lease was a little bit over market at the time, but the practice still made sense for him. And he was paying $41 a square foot in an area that did not support that market rent and was going to be escalated to 46 and then 52. Most of these leases will have annual compounding escalators. Some have a flat for 5 years, and then it goes up 10 or 15%, and then it's flat again for 5 years. But in this particular situation, he was very open to moving. We looked at purchase options. We had a bunch of deals negotiated. And the landlord came down on that all the way down to $32. So over the next 10 years, that particular dentist is going to save about $230,000 on his rent. And this was an average size general dentist office. So, there's real money to be saved, and it's just something to be aware of. And in that case, the landlord paid us a commission. So again, that didn't cost our doctor anything.
Wow. And, I think, one thing to really realize is that when you sign a lease of 10 years, you are responsible for pretty much every dollar owed on that lease for the entire term. And so it's a bigger contract than maybe people realize. And so the savings can really add up.
Yeah, they're huge. These are big deals. These are big, complex commercial deals. A lot of times it's going to be personal guarantees for the doctor and his spouse. And the value on these deals is often well north of your home. So nobody would buy a home without a real estate agent. Nobody would go to court without their own attorney. And it's really the same situation here.
Well, I appreciate you coming on, Brian. I think we learned a lot from you. A shorter episode today. We like to keep the lease episodes under control because I think it can get there's a lot in them, and so we like to keep these a little short. I appreciate you coming on today, Brian.
Yeah, very much. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it, George.
All right, I hope you guys really enjoyed that episode. One thing I forgot to ask Brian, I followed up with him via email, is I wanted to ask him about his company, Carr Healthcare Realty, that he works for. And they're nationwide, and so most states and larger cities, they have enough docs to support an individual like him. And I think they're a huge asset, not only because A, they're at no cost to you as the buyer, but B, working with somebody like Brian will allow you to have more leverage, I think, when you're negotiating, just because they might be a little bit more respected by the other side. And then on top of that, they have industry specific knowledge that you'll only learn by being involved in lots of deals. And most people are not involved in lots of deals. So I think that's really great. Now, one thing that Brian also wanted me to mention that we didn't talk about in the episode is whenever you're negotiating a tenant improvements allowance, so that's upfront money that the landlord will negotiate and give to you in your deal, usually that is included in your rent for the first term of the lease. So if you sign a 10-year lease and you got, let's just say, I don't know, like 50 grand upfront in tenant improvements, that 50 grand the landlord will put into the rent so that they'll get their 50 grand back by the end of the lease on top of what they already wanted for rent. So year 11, after you've gone through your first term, maybe should not even have an increase from year 10 because from that landlord's perspective, they've already gotten back their tenant improvements. It's almost like paying off their loan that they gave you. And so you should see a decrease in rent or maybe not an increase from year 10 to year 11, assuming that they gave you tenant improvements. So that's something that Brian wanted me to mention for you guys. And again, I think just in general, that was a really great interview. Every time I have somebody on talking about real estate for a startup, I always ask myself, I think the same thing I kept asking in season 2 with the financials. I kept asking myself, man, are we really going to get anything more on this topic? And every time I'm proved wrong, and I think there's a lot more value that's been given to you guys on a very important topic. So I hope you guys really enjoyed this, and go ahead and reach out to a healthcare realty individual in your area. If you're looking at doing a startup, I highly recommend it. So hopefully you guys got a lot from this episode. I know I did. And again, thank you guys for listening to the Shared Practices podcast, and we'll see you next week.